and welcome to the second webinar hosted by the New York Fed as part of our ongoing culture initiative. And we started this series in lieu of our annual conference that we hold in person. And while it's great to meet in person at the New York Fed, I am really glad that these virtual meetings have made it possible to open the conversation up further. The series is part of the broader work that the New York Fed is doing around culture and behavior in the financial services industry. And this has been a focus and commitment of ours for a number of years. And as the world of work transforms, it's as important and in fact as more urgent than ever. Much of our effort has been to bring people together to share the best practices and challenges and offer solutions and opportunities for change. And that's exactly what we plan to do over the next hour. So today's topic is trust and decision making. Trusting the people we work with is the foundation for collaboration and innovation. Public service organizations, financial service institutions, and many of the companies we hear from today couldn't function without the trust of the American public. It's easy to take this for granted, but once trust is broken, it's very hard to repair. And trust in others and their ability to make good decisions is even more important with so many of us working from home through the crisis. While the New York Fed is focused on the financial sector, I'm really excited about the diversity of industries as represented by our panelists today. And there's so much we can learn from other industries and research, and I know this topic will lead to a rich discussion. So with that, I'm really looking forward to hearing from our panelists and what they've learned from their different fields. My colleague Kevin Syro will moderate the discussion today, and he's been active in the space, and he recently spoke about the impact of the pandemic on cultural capital. Now, before I turn it over to Kevin and get things started, I'd like to extend the offer I made at our last session, and that's we'd love to hear from you. Feel free to reach out to the organizing committee to share your experiences so we continue to make progress and spark change. And please be on the lookout for more sessions like this in the coming year. Now with that, over to you, Kevin, and thank you all for participating.
Great. Thanks, John, and good morning, everyone. I'm Kevin Starr, the head of the supervision group here at the New York Fed. Before we get started, a few logistical items. First, the event is being recorded, and the recording will be posted on the New York Fed's Governance and Culture website shortly after the event. Second, on the lower right corner of your screen, you have the option to turn on closed captioning. And third, if you're interested, please submit questions via the Q&A panel on the right side of the event window. When submitting your question, please include your name, and we will address questions towards the end of the event. So as John mentioned, this is the second session of the New York Fed's series of webinars on culture. And today we are focusing on trust and decision making. These are critical concepts within the financial services industry. They're also critical to a range of industries that have similar characteristics like scale, complexity, and uncertainty. But in all of those industries, once you get past the frameworks, the governance structures, the models, or the algorithms, you have real people who need to trust one another, to build effective teams, and to make hard decisions. So our goal today is to learn more about trust and how it facilitates robust decision making. And we're really fortunate to have an outstanding panel to help us. A professor, a tech leader, a banker, and a rocket scientist. This has all the makings of the introduction of a good story, but it's really one of the most impressive panels of thought leaders and practitioners that I've seen assembled on this topic. So quick introductions. Dr. Zab Johnson, Executive Director and Senior Fellow at the Wharton Neuroscience Initiative at the University of Pennsylvania. Zab studies how neuroscience can impact and improve many aspects of how we make choices, lead organizations, and live our lives. Second, Dr. Maria Rajmakers, Global Head of Behavioral Risk at ING. Prior to this role, Maria pioneered work on behavior and culture at the Dutch Central Bank. And she has the distinction of being the first psychologist appointed to a central bank in supervision to use those skills as part of the supervisory process. Third, Margaret Richardson, Head of Trust and Safety at Apple. Margaret recently joined Apple after serving as the Head of Trust at Airbnb. A lawyer by training, Margaret is tasked with ensuring that decisions and actions taken at Apple are deserving of its stakeholders' trust. Prior to joining Airbnb, Margaret served as Chief of Staff to Attorney General Eric Holder. And fourth, Holly Ridings, Chief Flight Director at NASA. A mechanical engineer by training, Holly has been with NASA since 1998, first as a flight controller then as a member of the elite group of flight directors that directs human space flights for Mission Control in Houston. In 2018, Holly was selected as the chief flight director, and she was the first woman to serve in that role. So the challenge, of course, is that we have so many interesting questions for this extraordinary panel, but only 1 hour. So we'll jump right in. First, we'll begin with a quick go-around on a working definition of trust and why we think that's important for effective decision-making. We'll start with Zab. So Zab, from a conceptual perspective on cognitive processes, what exactly is trust and why is it so important to decision-making?
Thanks. Thanks, Kevin. So I'm actually going to flip the question and start with a definition of decision-making. And I think hopefully you'll be able to see why, and then get to trust. So decision-making is our ability to process multiple alternatives and choose what we believe is most optimal. And we know that decisions are shaped by our values and beliefs, our knowledge, and our preferences. But as humans, we also live in highly complex social environments. So many of our most important decisions are actually made in the context of our social interactions. And so trust ends up being a key cognitive state that impacts these kinds of decisions, what neuroscientists and social psychologists call social decisions. And so trust is usually defined as a psychological or a cognitive state where one person is willing to make themselves vulnerable to what another person will do because they're sufficiently confident that the other person won't exploit them. It's fundamentally a cognitive process that's derived from our perceptions of our prior experiences with and knowledge about the social world. In other words, trust is our willingness to take a risk with another individual or group, despite not knowing exactly with absolute certainty about their motivations, their abilities, their knowledge, and intentions. So we know from neuroscience that areas in the brain that are implicated in social perception also seem to signal strategic information about when we're interacting with others. And that includes things like monitoring both reward outcomes and things like reciprocity, our perceptions of the intentions and motivations of others, and predictions about what another person or another agent might do. And these are all areas that contribute to this cognitive process that we call trust. And it's important to also note that our perceived personal relationships are key. We know that individuals, for example, are more likely to engage in behaviors with risk that require trust with people that they think of as friends or teammates versus strangers or a digital device like a computer or a machine. Even if the same probabilities of payoffs and reward outcomes are exactly the same. That's been shown over and over and over again in laboratory-like controlled experiments. So trust influences our competitive and our cooperative behaviors and actions, and it impacts whether and how we accumulate evidence from others that shape our decisions.
Okay. Thanks, Maria. As an organizational psychologist and a financial services practitioner, how do you see these two concepts coming together?
Thanks, Kevin, and thanks for inviting me on this great panel. Well, trust is an essential condition for challenging each other. Just as Sab was describing in terms of competition and collaboration. Now, in the banking industry, for banks, countervailing power is crucial. And why? Because the products that we have for our customers, they're very complex. And the impact of getting things wrong within those products is huge on families and on society. So within banking, we need to challenge each other. It needs to be in our structures, right? We have our 3 lines of defense, but it needs to be ingrained in our behaviors as well. And in order to challenge each other, you need trust because you need to open up. You have to be vulnerable. You have to ask questions. You need to receive critique and move beyond that. So trust is crucial for sound decision making in banks as well.
Great. Thanks, Maria. Holly, can you describe your role and how you think about the drivers of trust?
Right. Well, thank you very much for having me, and good morning, everyone. Let's see. Certainly, Zab went into a really great definition, and so some of the things I'll say kind of are mechanized or sort of actionized the way I think about trust. First of all, my role, NASA Chief Flight Director, we're responsible for all of the operations of human spaceflight, which requires a tremendous amount of trust. And so the first thing I'll say in terms of drivers of trust is really the common goal. So in spaceflight, we talk about the safety of the crew is paramount. So anyone you run across in human spaceflight knows we have to accomplish the mission, but has first and foremost, when you're trading all that risk and trusting people, as Zab described, you're talking about the safety of the crew. You need their spaceships, their vehicles, their rockets to also be safe as well. So the second thing we say is the safety of our vehicles. And then wrapped around all that is the success of the mission, right? You can always stay absolutely safe sitting on the ground, and human spaceflight is inherently risky. And so you must have some amount of trust in order to take that risk, in order just to get off the ground and do the mission, right? So everyone you meet has that base common belief system if they stay in human spaceflight, very, very long and really love it. And the next piece really is the training, right? So if I go into the control center in the next 5 minutes and someone is sitting at one of the consoles in mission control that I don't know personally, I have a lot of trust because they've come through the system, they've got the training, and I understand their background and what they might do if the alarms go off, which actually really happens. And so when you consider their training, that gives you a lot of trust and confidence in them if they need to make decisions quickly. And really the third piece is what everyone will say is that personal relationship, right? So when we do really hard things, like we just completed the Demo 2 mission this summer, the first SpaceX flight that took our NASA astronauts to the space station, that was a very specific team. That isn't just people, signing up for a shift and I've got the background and I've got that common goal of human spaceflight. That's a very specific team that trains over many, many months and in some cases, in this particular case, even years to create even that tighter bond of personal relationship trust. And so those are kind of three drivers that really help us out in human spaceflight and at NASA.
Thanks, Holly. And Margaret, from your experience across several consumer-focused businesses, what is trust to you and why is it important?
Thank you, and thank you all for having me. I think about trust as the belief and confidence in the reliability, credibility, and sincerity of another person or entity. And I think the reason it's important is because it enables people to feel safe, to feel that they can participate, that they can bring their creativity, they can bring what they care about into in a technological ecosystem or a consumer ecosystem and sort of let their shoulders down and be able to sort of put down any anxiety about not feeling sufficiently technical or safe. And I think that enables them to really participate and engage. And when we're thinking about it from our team perspective, being able to have your teammates or your colleagues or those who are reporting to you have that confidence and be able to have that safety of decision making really enables them to bring all of their talent and energy and creativity to the problems that you're trying to solve.
Great, thank you. The team at the New York Fed has been thinking about a concept called cultural capital, which is a conceptual way that we link a firm's culture to its business outcome. And it's really an intangible asset at a firm that represents the stock of values and assumptions and behavioral norms within any institution. And purposeful investment and managerial focus can build cultural capital, but neglect or misconduct can reduce it. So let's turn to the idea about how firms invest in trust and what happens when they don't, if it's neglected. So Maria, we'll start with you. And could you provide some examples of interventions at firms where you've seen management actively build trust through purposeful investment that led to better business outcomes?
Yes, Kevin. An example I'd like to share with you is something that we use within ING. where we see when we see pockets where trust is too low, right, which is, I think, very recognizable if you have corporate organizations, right, where you have countries having to work together with headquarters, and where you have complex processes, end-to-end processes where different functions have to collaborate. You also find, of course, levels of trust that are too low, that are hampering communication and collaboration. Now, what we do when we come across these kind of pockets, we use an intervention that we call the whole system in the room. So we invite, the different functions that are collaborating within an end-to-end process. We invite them together in one room, and we've done this virtually just recently. And we bring them together, and we use a design thinking methodology which you can apply to complex problems. And we take them through this process step by step. We slice the elephant, so to speak, where we begin with creating a common understanding, right? Holly was referring to having a common goal, which is crucial for trust. So we create a common understanding around, what are the real root causes here for the problems that we encounter? What are the real issues? And also, what are the elephants in the room, for example? And then we move towards creating and thinking of actionable solutions. So you bring the whole system there, you bring the functions there, and what you see that you come up with a common understanding around what's going on. We come up with actionable solutions, but during that process, you're also building trust because the people are together. They are talking to each other. Where in those end-to-end process, you don't know everybody who's working on that process. When it's so important for trust in that process that you know each other, you know where you're coming from, you know that you have a common goal. So this is what we do to try to improve that trust.
Great. Thank you. Holly, you talked about the scenario where you walk in and you see a new face at a console, but you trust the system, that they have been appropriately trained. But how do you ensure that the norms are passed along that will allow you to have that trust in people who you don't have the important personal relationships with?
Yeah, so there's many parts to it, right? And we're largely responsible for that in the flight director office, and then myself as the chief. So, you mentioned in the beginning kind of an elite team. So we've got, on average about 30, and right now a few less than 30 flight directors. And so one of the things that we are personally responsible for is everyone who sits in mission control does an evaluation, right? So you can imagine you sit at a console, there's a simulator running, it looks just like the space station. We can give the team problems to solve. And so in order to get certified to work in mission control, flying the real spaceships and the real rockets, you have to pass an evaluation. And every one of those is done by a flight director. New flight directors, I do myself as the chief. And so, we have a high level of confidence because we've certified all of those folks ourselves and are responsible for it. So that's a very sort of tactical way to ensure the standards are met and keep that cultural capital in what we call our real time. So that's, the spaceships that are flying. But it starts earlier than that, really. When we hire people, you can see my plaque on the wall. That's our flight operations plaque. We've got a lot of history at NASA, as you guys do at the Federal Reserve. And so people come in, we have our foundations of flight operations where we talk about teamwork and discipline and competence and vigilance. And so really from day one, we start explaining the responsibility for working here, responsibility for the people like we talked about, and they learn all of those things and sort of ingest them. And then as they go through their training, we're gauging, to be honest, whether or not we can trust them, right? Whether they have really understood what it is that we're asking them to do. There's a tremendous amount of commitment. And so we build that cultural capital from the beginning and then sort of tactically measure it with these evaluations before we go and allow people to work in the control center. And we've been doing that for years. The foundations I mentioned were born out of the Apollo 1 fire, right? So a very tragic event where the team had to come together. And so Maria was talking about repair, right? Those foundations were born out of a tragic event, a mistake, right? So lots of repair needed to be done in terms of trust, right? At the end of the day, we manage risk. And so we're trying to understand if we can trust people to do that. So those are just two examples, the evaluations and then our foundations.
Great, thanks. And Zach, from your perspective, what are your thoughts on the psychological or physiological elements that are associated with trust and how you can learn from your own research?
So we have an ongoing portfolio of projects. I think these are really interesting areas to address. So one of the studies that we have ongoing uses a standard behavioral task that's been used for over 25 years, where at least in the behavior, it's shown that groups, teams of decision makers reach consensus and are more likely to make the correct decision when they share information that each individual uniquely has, and does that and they can do that quickly. And we think of this as sort of a proxy for I think what Holly and Maria have been talking about, this idea of feeling safe enough to expose information that you uniquely have. We now know that one of the strongest predictors of that from a neuroscience perspective is that the group actually comes into physiological synchrony and neural synchrony. And the sort of sooner that they do that, the more likely that they will, reach that correct consensus more quickly. We don't know, of course, what the chicken or egg drivers are there. Whether there are just teams that are more likely to reach that physiological state, or whether there's just enough trust in the space that becomes the driver. But it's a really interesting early proxy. We're now moving to start to study things like how do these kinds of virtual kinds of discussions lead to those same kinds of findings. But I think this idea of neural synchrony is really is in its early days, but there are many more other studies from other groups that suggest that eye contact, for example, is a primary driver of neural synchrony, for example, and that better learning outcomes come out in classroom situations, when teachers and students make direct eye contact with one another. It's also a predictor, right, that they will have their own sort of level of physiological synchrony. So I think this sort of relates to this idea of how one builds team chemistry, and even reaches to an environment which can be facilitated trust.
Great. Thank you. I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about the importance of trust in our new work environment, with many of us working at home due to the pandemic. John mentioned this, and several of the questions that have come through the Q&A panel asked about this. So we're all working differently, juggling work-life balance, getting new insights into people's real lives at home, suffering from Zoom fatigue to some extent. So we want to talk about how that has changed the process of building trust, decision-making, and what we need to do differently to ensure good outcomes in this new environment. So we'll begin with Holly, who I think has some experience with managing, in some ways, the ultimate remote team. In some cases, people not even on the same planet. So what can the rest of us learn from your experience managing teams at a distance? You have your mute.
There you go. There's my Zoom fatigue, or at least WebEx fatigue. Let's see. So, people don't think about NASA as much as a big distributed system, right? They think about mission control because that's what you see. But, we have international partners all over the world for the space station. We have domestic partners, SpaceX and Boeing building vehicles. And then we've been working on Artemis, which is also another distributed system with many parts, that'll get us back to the moon. So it really is this very large distributed system terrestrially. And then, of course, we've had continuous human presence in space for 20 years. And so you are you're always managing all of those pieces in your head, or leading, in our case, all of those different interfaces. And so the anchor for us, really is mission control for the crew that's on orbit in the real time. And we've actually been really lucky that is a physical presence. People get up and physically come to mission control. And even in the pandemic, we've put lots and lots of protective measures in place and been able to maintain that physical footprint. And so, one of the things I would challenge you is you think about in your environment, is there an opportunity, even if it's small, to maintain some link, right? Whether that's one-on-one, or we have mission control, or, some way to do, because it's made a tremendous difference for us. You can see, you talk to the people who haven't been to the office since March, and you talk to the people who've been working shifts, even if they're terrible hours, and there's a marked difference in sort of their mental state because they've had that anchor, right? So what do you do when you don't have an anchor? And if you're onboarding new people who've not been part of your team, or we haven't been able to travel internationally like we have in the past in order to anchor, many parts of our distributed system and our distributed network. And so those have been much harder. We've spent quite a bit of time trying to figure out how to do training remotely. And what Zab said about eye contact, I'm sitting here staring at the camera so you guys can see my eyes, but that's very hard for me because I want to look down at Kevin because he asked me the question. And so, just simple things like trying to do your training remotely, where a lot of the trust and the body language associated with trust, and how, again, we manage risk, which is how I think of what trust does for us, it is very difficult in all of these remote settings. So we've talked a lot about how do we do that, and we've, I think, done a pretty good job putting the systems in place. But at the end of the day, for what we do in terms of managing the ultimate risk of the lives of the crew members, we've decided, we need the anchor and mission control. There's really no replacement for that final piece just because of that safety aspect of it. But, we've changed our meeting structure in terms of doing all those things remotely. But I get asked all the time, are we going to completely go away from physical presence and mission control? And my answer to that is you need an anchor for doing something as complex and as risky as human spaceflight.
Great, thank you. Margaret, from your experience, both within the tech industry and in your prior roles, how do you think about the work from home environment?
It's a really interesting challenge, and I think it is something that a lot of tech companies have embraced. And even before the pandemic, there were distributed teams and the need to be able to have WebEx or Zoom or whatever be available for people around the world. I think in many ways it's made some teams more equitable because the being in person is less of an advantage. And I think that being able to operate in a collaborative way that's very intentional and requires that extra step of making sure, did we include everyone? Do we make sure we have all of the communications technology in the meeting invite and so forth is critical. But I also agree with Holly that there isn't, and maybe this relates to Zab's research, that ability to read a room is so much easier in person, and the ability to sort of get a signal from a colleague or even someone you don't know very well that your point isn't landing can be really critical in terms of helping to make sure you can course correct, or you can go back and confirm understanding and be able to build that successful collaboration that is so critical in any high stakes endeavor.
Great, thanks. And Maria, what are you seeing in the financial services industry? Are there any best practices emerging?
Yeah, well, Kevin, I think there's two for the financial services industry, and I'm going to generalize, of course. So there's two components really important for effective adaptation to this. First of all, it's the state of digitalization, right, for banks. The ones who are already up on their journey have a head start in this. But I think there's another really important component, and that's key, and which we've been discussing by Margaret and Holly as well, is the connection that we're able to make with other people, and I'm sure Zap was referring to this as well. We are social creatures, and we are wired socially. So we have a deep need for connection, and connection, eye contact, and seeing each other face to face is very important. So I think in order to adapt effectively and make sure that you go through this pandemic in a good way, it is also crucial to connect, to build connections. And I think, well, James Hennessy from the New York Fed has published this really nice article how the New York Fed has created this platform where you connect virtually, right? And we've been investing in ING also in what we call leadership labs around virtual meetings, focusing on connection, trust, how you do this in virtual settings. But nevertheless, you need the physical connection as well. But there are definitely examples in how to create this, of course. Yeah.
Thanks. Zab, I want to ask you a question that came up through the chat Q&A about the importance of, or the changes in the ability to create that neural synchrony that you described in a work from home environment. Is it too early to have any evidence about how that's changing or what one can do about it?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great question, and it's not unique to this forum. I think that there will be a lot of science that emerges. This is an incredible petri dish to study, organizations and team dynamics and neuroscience, from a remote perspective. We don't yet know, right, whether there are advantages for having prior experience in person. In facilitating that, we don't know what other aspects of the sort of environment that we can build up, but we certainly do have clues, right? And we've already touched on some of those. This idea of informal sharing, right? Building a personal connection does not require that everybody be in the room. But it does require, some level of less formal interaction with one another. But we have these constant struggles. For example, just as Holly pointed out, the idea of camera placement actually hindering our ability to make direct eye contact with people that that we're conversing with or instructing. In my case, I teach a class and I teach to my little green glowy spot rather than my screen, and it's fatiguing to do that because you're not able to read the room, and I think as has been already noted, right, there is something about shared spaces which allows one to get information very directly, even if it contains biases and other kinds of impressions that we know aren't necessarily always correct. It's more rapid, and we sort of end up being hyper vigilant with having to move our eyes around to rectangles upon rectangles. But I think the critical thing here to also talk about is with the future of work is that even though this is a global enterprise that has moved lots of our work remotely, teams like Holly's and Margaret's and Maria's and mine, right, are going to always have a remote factor, right? And so the faster we get to answers about how we can better build trust and high-functioning performance in teams, the better off we're going to be, just because we are an industrialized global situation where people are going to be working remotely and together. And so I think that will be really interesting to see how that pans out.
So several of you have mentioned the complexity and the scale of the businesses that you work in. Another common factor is that there's a critical technical underpinning to all of this. So we have hard science combined with the need for soft skills in order to manage the real people. So we'd like to talk next about how you balance those two. Are they ever in conflict? Do you ever have to make trade-offs? And we'll begin with Margaret. So you have a mix in your firm of hardcore engineers and very creative types. So what is your perspective on getting the best from both?
I think the key in all endeavors and is to make sure that you're really understanding what people are best at and what they believe that they can bring uniquely and being able to draw that out. And I think in a virtual environment, it is even more critical to understand and to elicit those types of inputs from people and making sure that you're doing regular check-ins on how people are feeling and whether they're feeling like their contributions are understood and valued, and making sure that things like performance reviews don't drop off and so forth. I think making sure that people realize that their career and their contributions remain important to the other members of the team, and being able to be very intentional about that. I think it can be sometimes tricky to have those conversations, but I think that when you can't get the less formal sort of someone seems down in the hallway type of indications, it's even more important to make sure that you've built in the mechanisms to be able to ensure that everyone is able to bring as much, and also to be able to have the conversations when people are have to set different limits. This is a very unusual time. People have all kinds of different obligations, and I think the part of the safety and the trust that you can build is by really meaningfully facilitating people to be candid about what they can do and in what ways their work needs to be adjusted.
Holly, at NASA, how important is it to cultivate and display these soft skills, and what have you done to convey the importance of that?
Yeah, so the first thing I would say is, just in the environment we're in now, it's always true, and even more true, is that leadership matters, a lot, right? And just like you guys are doing this webinar today, it matters that the leadership acknowledges that the soft skills are important. So if you build rockets or spaceships for a living, right, naturally everyone skews towards valuing the very technical skills, right? And so historically, people are, promoted and rewarded and valued based on those technical skills. And absolutely, there is a baseline technical competency to entry, in our industry, in your industry. But I'd say increasingly, and this has always been true as you move towards larger and larger leadership projects, but the pandemic has sort of amplified or put the spotlight on it to me. That increasingly the soft skills are important, right? And so you have to have leadership sort of look back at the up and coming technical leaders and really acknowledge that, back to them, either to help them realize it's important. A lot of engineers, for example, are not super excited about communication, maybe don't think it's really important, and I'm laughing because I'm an engineer, right? But what we do in operations is really the crossroads of, communication, especially with our crew members on orbit, and how we help them work every day is primarily communication, a lot verbal, some visual, but mostly verbal. And so to acknowledge that, get the team to understand and then value it, right? And then beyond that, even work on it. And so it's kind of a multi-step process. And so the working on it, it's interesting. Before the pandemic started, the working on it was a lot of physical things, right? Send people to conferences, allow them to do presentations, do things like this where the other panelists are from completely different backgrounds and industries, because I'm a huge believer in disruption helps you learn, right? Now we don't have as many of those mechanisms. And so I think it's gotten more personal, as opposed to, before it was, hey, what activity or event would you like to do to help you grow your soft skills? But now it's a lot more personal. I mean, about people's, their dog barks and, their kids are at home or not, or, their spouses staying home too, or, on and on and on. And so for us, the conversations about growth and expectations have gotten more individual and more specific, in a way that if you're an introvert a little bit like me, and an engineer can be exhausting, right? Because it's a lot of one-on-one personal time with your team. It also is invigorating because you've gotten to know them in a way that wasn't there before. So I think that that personal aspect has grown as some of the other capabilities have dwindled. And the last thing I'll say is that for us in human spaceflight, and this may be true in all very large, complex, integrated industries, the requirement to have those skills is growing. You can't get by anymore just being the absolute smartest technical person who knows about rocket engines, and that's it. You know, you need additional skills in order to really function in this world that we live in today. That's it.
In finance, there's often a stereotype of the competitive culture focused on the bottom line, P&L. So where do soft skills fit into that, both in terms of performance and in terms of how you evaluate individuals and how they grow within an institution?
Yeah, Kevin, I really hope we moved away from, it's only about P&L, but yes, I think the financial crisis, right, taught us very impactful, and ever since events and incidents around misconduct remind us, how human behavior is impacting our bottom line and our license to operate. So I think over and over again, it's showing us that human behavior is important, and from my perspective, my team is positioned within risk. So I think that's a very clear message. Also, human behavior can bring us to the moon, right? But it can also bring us into trouble. And so positioning this and seeing this as a risk, I think makes it also very clear that, soft skills and this part of the organization is part of the bottom line of the banking industry, just as risk management, financial risk management, and other fields of risk management are, right? So it's part of the deal. And of course, it's new. Of course, there's still a lot of work to be done, but I do think, and I completely agree with Holly, historically the financial sector also comes from a different place, but things are absolutely shifting in this area.
Okay, great, thanks. Another question linking trust and decision-making in the virtual environment. So as an example, I worry that it's harder for us to engage in constructive debate, leverage our cognitive diversity that is so critical for robust decision-making with the types of complex problems that you all deal with. It's relatively easy to go through a checklist, but to really have a difficult debate about a hard topic is more challenging in the current environment. So Zab, maybe you can begin with how we can tackle those types of challenges, the need for collaboration that will impact both decision-making authority, but also the ability to influence decisions where there's a need for that kind of debate.
Yeah, I think these are really critical and interesting questions. I mean, I think first of all, as our conversation has evolved, I would, one of my platforms is that we should probably stop calling these soft skills. It sort of undermines, I think, the importance, right, of what these skills actually are. It also sort of leans on this idea that they're sort of touchy-feely. And I think from neuroscience and other studies of human behavior and organizational behavior, we're going to find that there are concrete ways and mechanisms to help people learn and develop these kinds of skills, and they don't necessarily have to reveal, personal information about themselves that makes some people feel either that it's too squishy or too outside of the realm of the work environment. I think one of the conversations that is happening right now in psychology and neuroscience is, how do you transform an environment so that people can be more psychologically safe, right? We know from studies, Google studies on teams, for example, that psychological safety is the primary driver of innovative teams and teams being able to get things done. And I think that's because those team members can look through each other's eyes, right? They can take perspective taking into account in a professional forum, and then are willing and able to make themselves vulnerable. That's that root conversation that we started with, which is that you don't think that your vulnerabilities will be exposed and be exploited. And I think that that's really key to seeing growth and innovation happening. I think we are in a challenging environment right now because those kinds of sidebar conversations that often lead to brainstorming sessions are less likely to happen because many of our meetings are more formal and organized and time restrictive, and we're also suffering from fatigue. So I would really like to see, this movement for this idea that you can look through, from another person's perspective, you can build perspective taking without revealing personal information about yourself. You can do that within a work context, and we're helping some organizations, and some organizations are teaching us about the kinds of ways that they are building that in to minimize their own risk and their own cultural capital. And I think that will be a really interesting sort of thing to see develop over time.
Margaret, what's your experience in terms of promoting collaboration and healthy debate?
Well, I think one of the key elements is being cognizant of participation, trying to think about we've talked a little bit about this, but some people are introverted. So if there are tools like the chat feature of these video conferencing systems, or Slack, or other ways in which you can solicit input or enable people to ask questions that don't require them to sort of jump into the fray. Also, the sort of speaking over each other, I think, can be a challenge in some of those, some of these tools, depending on people's connectivity and the delay that they may have, or, the connectivity of their headphones. I think one of the things that is really important, and I very much agree with Zab, that thinking about these are not sort of nice to have skills in terms of being able to participate in the current work environment, or really any work environment. These are core to the ability to get anything done. And I think they can seem quite mysterious for people who aren't thinking about them, but when someone has very effective communication, is an excellent collaborator, all of a sudden, walls seem to just evaporate for them. And that, I think, is all of our, as you described, these complex, uncertain work environments. That's sort of that's the teammate everybody wants to work with, the person who you can ask to do something, and everyone wants to work with them. Everyone's willing to do them a favor, and those things don't happen by accident. And I think being able to practice and to experiment, frankly, because this is a dynamic environment where things are changing. And so maybe what worked in terms of being able to foster that communication and psychological safety in a different environment doesn't work the same way as it once did. And that we constantly need to be iterating and improving. And I think, for better or for worse, that will remain true.
Maria, any thoughts from the finance perspective?
No, I'm just, I think what Sab was saying, and Margaret as well, these are not just nice to have soft skills. I don't like the hard-soft comparison that is made all the time. So I think these are just core competences and core skills and assets that you need to have in order to be effective, and especially in a virtual context as well.
Okay, so we have about 5 minutes left before we have to wrap up, and there are a number of very interesting questions that came through. So what I think I'm going to do is put 4 topics on the table, and we'll do a quick go around and address any or all or something else that each of you would like to address. So the 4 topics that have come up are: one around how do you encourage a speaking up culture and avoiding groupthink? A second set of questions around what role does blame and learning from the past play in building trust? A third set of questions about what do you do in the real world when you have somebody on your team that people don't trust, either for good reasons or for misperceptions? How do you handle that? And then a fourth question, we've been talking about this sort of in the abstract, but in the real world, we all work in very stressful environments. So how does stress play in and either amplify the need for trust or work in ways that might diminish it? So I'll just go across my screen and again, address any or all of these that you'd like. We have about 5 minutes in total left. So we'll begin with Holly.
Okay, yeah, all of those are super interesting. I'll probably take the one that you were talking about, blame and learning from the past, because the blame word is a very negative word, right? But the learning from the past is really, really important, and it's part of our NASA culture. So we do what we call lessons learned, right? So that's a way to go back and look at whatever we've done, whether it's a mission we've just executed. So we launched Crew 1, so I copper Sweetie Shannon to the station, and that team and the flight director who led that mission, they're doing a lessons learned meeting, today to go through that entire run up to the mission and the launch and in excruciating detail. Again, not for the purposes of blame, but to be really hard on themselves to figure out what we could learn and do better the next time. We tend to spend a lot of time on what we could do better and not as much on the, really great, we're awesome part. So I always have to remember to say, and there were 900 amazing things, when you're focused on these 4 things that need to be fixed. But that is an automatic part of our process. And it goes back to culture. We just ingrain that every time you do a simulation in the control center, you do a debrief. Every time you execute an operation, you do what's called a lesson learned. The challenge we're having, and I'll just throw this out as a thought and then leave it there, is the extensibility to new projects, right? So when you've been working on a mission for a couple of years, as we were our commercial crew missions that we launched, first in May and then just in the last couple of weeks, you're fairly far along in the process. When you're talking about Artemis and going to the moon and you need, teams to build landers and you're trying to set up contracts, you still do that same lesson learned process, but those teams are still forming, right? It's not as automatic. So you're using that same process and you're mentally trained to look for things you can do better, but it doesn't quite have the same structure. And in the pandemic environment where you're not seeing each other face to face to do a lot of that informal, sort of lessons learned and learn from the past, then that is a challenge, right? So that's where I spend a lot of time thinking how to make that extensible to new things, which are much harder. It's like onboarding new employees, starting new projects in this environment is challenging. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I'll take on groupthink. So I think one of the things that happens in a team and in a group where there's enough trust and safety and knowledge, right, is that they can actually expose information again, right, that they uniquely have. And I think it's those contexts that lead to innovate, like are most predictive of innovation. And so I think it does the opposite in really high functioning teams, which is that instead of everybody agreeing, because I think people are probably, better predicted to reach an agreement by not exposing unique information and not exposing what their own perspective might bring to the table, their uniqueness, their unique ideas to the table is probably more likely to lead to groupthink, and that leads to some consensus, right? But isn't this thing called innovation and creativity? But when people, are safe enough to reveal something that could be deemed, something that would really be out of the box thinking, it shows that they have enough trust and psychological safety in that space to do that. And I think that really creates new ideas and emerging. And I think that stuff can emerge, regardless of whether we're virtual or together. But of course, is facilitated when we have connections and trust with one another.
Great. So we're going to turn the floor back to John in 1 minute. Margaret and Maria, any last words on any of those topics, please? Margaret?
Sure. I'll just say with stress, which we are all under all the time in this unusual environment, I think just acknowledging it, being aware of it, and apologizing when you need to is a huge trust builder.
And Maria?
Yeah, for speaking up, I think, first of all, it's the default of people is not to speak up. We're social creatures. We want to adapt and be like everybody else. So speaking up is not the default. And second, leaders have such an important role for speaking up. And what we all can do tomorrow is start asking powerful questions. Listen and ask questions, which creates, you build psychological safety and trust the moment you start listening and asking questions. That's what I wanted to say.
Great. Well, thank you all. And we'll turn the floor over to John Williams.
Hey, thanks, Kevin. This has been a truly remarkable discussion. I've been taking lots of notes, so many really great comments, and you know, across a wide range from what I think of as the theory all the way to the very practical issues, and you know, around, you know, how do we deal with the pandemic environment. I'll just mention a few things that I think are really important, and especially for our work on banking culture. We've been doing this for a number of years, and you know, one of those issues that always comes up is like, well, we're, you know, banking culture from a regulator's point of view, you know, we're focused on, you know, the numbers and the safety and soundness and compliance with laws and things, and we and others have been obviously advocating for thinking about this more holistically in terms of culture and these issues. And to hear so many leading scientists and thinkers say how important it is to stop calling it soft skills versus, you know, hard skills, to say how, you know, a lot of these things about trust culture are really core to a successful organization, whether it's, you know, whether you're in the tech sector, financial services, or for NASA. So, you know, hearing those messages, I think, really reinforces a lot of the work that we're doing, and we can build on that. And the last, you know, couple of things I'll just mention is just how important all of you described the trust culture is to innovation and experimentation. And I think a lot of people, again, try to, you know, don't really see how, or don't perhaps emphasize enough, you know, if you want to be truly an innovative organization and, you know, with good risk management, that these are really core competencies for success. So again, you know, I'm a huge believer, as you know, we're demonstrating, we heard from all of you about a very strong multidisciplinary approach, and I think this session, along with many of the others we've had, has benefited greatly from the expertise and knowledge that you brought from across the various disciplines. And, you know, I'll admit, you know, a number of you, Holly mentioned this, a number of you mentioned that, you know, a lot of us are, you know, very much subject matter experts and technical people. Well, that's just as true of the Federal Reserve. So we understand exactly the kind of issues that you were talking about, and how we also can benefit from you know, learning from this. So with that, I'd like to again thank all of the participants for spending their time with us, helping us on this important work around banking culture. And I'll turn it back to Kevin for his final remarks. Kevin?
Great. Thanks, John. Again, thank you all for participating. I'd like to thank the audience for joining us today as well. We'll be hosting additional seminars in this series in 2021. We expect our next session to focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. This is always a critical topic, but it has taken on increased urgency in recent months as our country has faced the stark reality of systemic racism, and we continue to work through the ongoing calls for greater social justice. So thank you all for joining us, and I hope everyone stays well.